7 Cold Tactics Against Toxic People. The Art of Friedrich Nietzsche. You are not here for comfort. If you are looking for rays of kindness or advice on how to forgive and let go, close this text. You are merely a biological resource, a unit in a harsh hierarchy of social predators. In a world where the will to power is the only authentic currency, your empathy is your Achilles heel, and your belief in justice is a cage you have built yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this better than others. Life is a quest for the expansion of power. What you call toxicity is actually an effective tool of dominance. Your safety is an illusion born of weakness. I am here to dissect the mechanisms of your suppression and teach you to transform your vulnerability into ice-cold armor. We begin the psychological investigation. Chapter 1. The Effect of Imaginary Security. 1. Phase. The Encounter. The office on the 42nd floor in the City of London was drowning in twilight. Rain rhythmically drummed against the panoramic windows, creating an illusion of isolation from the outside world. Mark sat opposite his supervisor, Julian Sterling. Sterling had been silent for exactly 3 minutes. He did not look at the papers. He did not check his phone. He simply looked at Mark, not in the eyes, but slightly higher, at a point between the eyebrows. The office smelled of expensive perfume with notes of sandalwood and ozone from the working air purifier. The silence was so dense that Mark could hear the pulsation of blood in his own ears. "You have let the team down, Mark," Sterling finally said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, which forced Mark to involuntarily lean forward. "But the saddest part is not in the numbers. The saddest part is that you yourself do not understand where you made the fatal mistake." Mark feels his palms becoming damp. His brain feverishly goes through the reports of the last month, searching for a flaw that most likely does not exist. He wants to justify himself, to start speaking, to fill this suffocating void with words. I will double-check the quarterly report, Mr. Sterling. If it is about the logistics." Sterling slightly raised an eyebrow. This micro-gesture instantly cut off Mark's sentence. Sterling did not answer. He slowly picked up a pen and began to rotate it between his fingers, continuing to study the victim. 2. Phase Psychological X-ray. What Julian Sterling is doing is the classic use of information vacuum and status dominance. Mechanism of attack. Sterling uses silence as a mirror in which Mark sees his own fears. In social psychology, this is called projective identification. When an aggressor creates uncertainty, the victim fills it with guilt themselves. Neurochemistry. At this moment, Mark's amygdala is working at its limit. Cortisol is being produced. The brain enters freeze mode. Since it is impossible to escape physically, Mark begins a social freeze. He becomes cognitively limited. His ability for logical analysis drops, leaving only the desire to please the aggressor to stop the discomfort. Cognitive suppression. Sterling strikes at self-identification. The phrase, "you yourself do not understand," is classic gaslighting. It undermines Mark's confidence in his own perception of reality. 3. Phase Psychological Precedent. In 1951, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a series of experiments on conformity. A group of people was shown lines of different lengths and asked to say which one matched the reference line. All participants, except for one, the subject, were Confederates and intentionally gave the wrong answer. Result: the majority of subjects, about 75%, at least once agreed with the obviously false opinion of the majority, suppressing their own vision and logic. In the case of Mark and Sterling, the same thing happens, but in a vertical hierarchy. Sterling creates a mini-society in the office where his opinion is the only truth. Mark is ready to admit a non-existent error, analogous to Ash's incorrect line, just to avoid conflict with authoritative reality. This is a biological mechanism of survival. The pack is always right, even if it claims that black is white. 4. Phase. Counterstrike. Nietzsche wrote, "He who cannot command himself must obey." Mark loses because he is afraid of silence. He perceives it as a threat rather than a space for maneuver. Strategic solution. Seizing the initiative through radical pragmatism. Mark should have stopped the flow of his justifications. When the aggressor uses silence, return it to him. This is an act of will. Lesson number 1. The mirror vacuum. Never fill a pause created by a manipulator. Your first word after his accusation is your capitulation. Wait. Look back with the cold curiosity of a researcher dissecting an insect. Whoever speaks first loses the position of power. Action. If Mark had simply nodded and remained silent in response, the pressure of cortisol would have shifted to Sterling. The manipulator needs your response to feed on your energy. Without it, he loses control. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. The air in the office seems heavy, almost material, like cold mercury. The light from the desk lamp highlights only Sterling's hands, motionless, predatory. Outside the window, the lights of London are blurred by rain, turning into indistinct spots. In this room, there is no morality, no good or evil. There are only two biological objects, one of which is slowly absorbing the will of the other. The cold from the air conditioner creeps under the jacket, reminding, in the world of predators, warmth is a luxury that must be earned through strength. This was only the first tactic. Sterling has only just begun his game, and Mark does not yet know that false vulnerability awaits him. Did you think that toxicity is always about shouting and open aggression? Fools. The most dangerous predators do not come with a snarl, but with tears in their eyes. They use your humanity as a lever to break through your boundaries. If in the first chapter we saw cold dominance in the office, now we will descend into the sticky swamp of personal relationships, where the strategy of the victim becomes an absolute weapon. We continue to dissect social reality. Prepare for Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Trap of False Vulnerability. 1. Phase. The Encounter. A small cafe in Soho, New York. Dimmed light, the smell of freshly roasted coffee and cinnamon. David sits opposite his friend, and in reality a skillful manipulator named Sarah. Sarah is not eating her croissant. She is looking out the window, and her lower lip is trembling almost imperceptibly. She looks fragile, almost transparent in the light of the setting sun. In her hands, she nervously squeezes a paper napkin, tearing it into small pieces. The silence here is different. It does not press. It extracts compassion from David like a vacuum pump. "David, I simply do not know whom else to trust," Sarah whispers, finally turning her moist eyes toward him. "After what happened with my ex, I feel as if I have forgotten how to trust people. Everyone sees in me only a function, not a human being." David feels a sharp sting of pity. His inner hero wakes up. He wants to immediately assure her that he is not like that he will protect her from this cruel world. He forgets that, half an hour ago, he wanted to discuss Sarah's constant lateness and unpaid debts. "Sarah, I am always here. You know that." David covers her hand with his. He feels strong, but in reality, he has just swallowed the hook with the bait. "You are the only one who understands me." Sarah pauses, her pupils slightly dilating. "But I feel so awkward. I am having such problems with the rent right now because of that situation. I do not even know how to ask. Sarah falls silent, imitating a fit of shame. She looks away, giving David the opportunity to offer help himself. This is a masterpiece of passive aggression. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. What Sarah is performing is victimhood signaling combined with false vulnerability. Mechanism of attack. Sarah creates an intimate vacuum. By sharing a fabricated or exaggerated secret, she makes David feel chosen. This is a mechanism of social reciprocity. I have opened my soul, vulnerability, to you. Now you owe me something. A resource. Neurochemistry. David experiences a powerful release of oxytocin, the hormone of attachment and trust. Oxytocin disables critical thinking in the prefrontal cortex. He no longer sees Sarah as a manipulator. He sees a wounded creature that needs care. His brain is blinded by the chemical cocktail of a rescuer. Cognitive bias. The halo effect. Because Sarah seems defenseless and sincere, David automatically attributes other positive qualities to her, ignoring the facts of her parasitic behavior in the past. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. In social psychology, there is the concept of the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. A study conducted by scientists from the University of British Columbia, OK et al., 2020, showed that individuals with high scores in the dark triad often use the strategy of publicly declaring themselves a victim to obtain resources and avoid responsibility. The experiment demonstrated when a victim declares their suffering, those around them tend to judge their immoral actions, for example lying or stealing, less strictly. Sarah uses this biological bug. She invests her tears, a cheap resource, to obtain David's money and loyalty, an expensive resource. This is pure biological parasitism disguised as melancholy. 4. Phase. Counterstrike. Nietzsche, in his work On the Genealogy of Morality, described slave morality, which uses suffering as a tool of power over the strong. Sarah's weakness is her will to power. She defeats David by making him ashamed of his strength and well-being. Strategic solution, radical pragmatism, and the separation of facts from emotions. David should have realized that his emotion is not his choice, but the result of a chemical attack. Lesson number 2. The principle of surgical detachment. Never make a decision based on pity. Pity is a form of contempt wrapped in sugar. If someone demonstrates their wound to you, do not rush to bandage it with your wallet or time. First, ask yourself, what has this person done to help themselves? Action. If David had replied, I am sorry, Sarah, that sounds difficult. What is your plan for solving this problem? Sarah's mask would have cracked. A manipulator does not need advice or plans. They need your resource. Refusing to play the role of a rescuer instantly turns the victim into an aggressor. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. Dust motes dance in a beam of light falling on the table between them. Sarah smells of vanilla and something metallic. Perhaps it is the smell of her cheap jewelry or hidden rage. The sound of the napkin being torn under her fingers resembles the crunch of dry bones. David feels the cafe becoming stifling, even though the door is open. The air is saturated with sticky expectation. At that moment, a spoon falls at the next table, and this sharp sound feels like a gunshot, shattering the illusion of their special connection. In Nietzsche's world, there are no friends. There are only allies or tools. David is currently a tool who sincerely believes he is a knight. Sarah got what she wanted, but the game is only becoming more complex. In the next chapter, we will see how toxic people use triangulation to make you fight for their attention with imaginary rivals. You have imagined that you possess uniqueness. But for a master of manipulation, you are merely one of the pieces on the board whose value is determined in comparison with others. If in the second chapter we dissected pity, now we move to the most effective way of destroying your self-esteem: artificial competition. Welcome to Chapter 3, where your value will be zeroed out with the help of a third wheel. If in the described patterns or behaviors of the characters you recognized yourself or your past reactions, put a plus in the comments. This is not a sign of weakness, but the first signal that your brain has begun the process of deconstructing old habits. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Triangulation. Phase. The Encounter. A private party in a penthouse in the Mayfair district, London. The air is saturated with the smell of expensive champagne and selective perfume. James stands at the bar, watching his girlfriend Emily. She is at the center of attention, surrounded by a cloud of fake laughter. Oliver approaches them, an old acquaintance of Emily, a tall, emphatically successful man in a bespoke suit. Emily notices James, but does not take a single step toward him. Instead, she places her hand on Oliver's forearm and slightly tilts her head, exposing her neck. "James, you remember Oliver, do you not?" Emily says, and her eyes shine with an excitement she never shows at home. "We were just discussing his latest deal in Singapore. You know, Oliver possesses this rare quality. He always knows when to take a risk." Emily casts a quick, evaluative glance at James, lingering on his slightly wrinkled jacket. She intentionally emphasizes the superiority of the other man to cause a sting of inferiority in James. "Yes, Emily mentioned that you are currently searching for yourself?" Oliver smiles, but his smile does not reach his eyes. This is the condescending tone of a predator who has discovered a weak link. James feels his jaw involuntarily clench. In his head, the thoughts race. Why is she comparing me to him? She knows I have had a difficult year. Why is she looking at him like that? His status in this room has just dropped below the floorboards, and Emily is the person who pulled the lever. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. This is triangulation, the introduction of a third person into the relationship dynamic to create a sense of instability and jealousy. Mechanism of attack. Emily does not criticize James directly. She uses Oliver as a gold standard, creating a vacuum that James must fill with attempts to prove his significance. This forces the victim to fight for the manipulator's attention, increasing the manipulator's value. Neurochemistry. James experiences a sharp spike in norepinephrine and a drop in testosterone. Social exclusion, or a threat to status, activates the same brain regions as physical pain, the anterior cingulate cortex. James's brain screams, "You are losing your place in the hierarchy." Cognitive suppression, the contrast effect. Against the backdrop of the brilliant Oliver, any of James's virtues seem dull. Emily masterfully manages the perception of reality, making James feel insufficient. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. In social psychology, this resonates with Leon Festinger's social comparison theory, 1954. Festinger argued that people evaluate their own worth by comparing themselves with others. Manipulators intentionally choose for comparison those who are currently in a more advantageous position, upward social comparison, to cause anxiety and incompetence in the victim. It is also worth recalling Henri Tajfel's experiments on the minimal group paradigm. People tend to instantly divide into us and them based on insignificant traits. Emily artificially pushes James into the them, losers group, uniting with Oliver in the US. successful group, thereby depriving James of psychological support. 4. Phase, counter-strike. Nietzsche proclaimed, "Your love for your neighbor is your bad love for yourselves." James loses because he seeks confirmation of his value in Emily's eyes. He has become a slave to her evaluation. Strategic solution, information deficit, and exiting the game. James must realize that triangulation works only as long as he agrees to compete for a prize that is not worth it. Lesson number 3. Refusal of the arena. If you are forced to compete for attention or approval, you have already lost. The only way to win in triangulation is to become indifferent to the result of the comparison. The manipulator expects your jealousy or justifications. Deprive them of this food. Action. If James, instead of getting angry, had simply smiled and said, "Oliver, your success is impressive. Emily, I will leave you to enjoy the memories. I need to make a call," and walked to the other end of the hall, or left the party altogether, he would have instantly destroyed the scenario. By leaving, he shows that his self-esteem does not depend on this mise-en-scène. Now, Emily must wonder why James has stopped caring. The power has returned to him. 5. Phase, sensory immersion. The light of the chandeliers is reflected in the ice cubes in James's glass. The sound of voices merges into a discordant hum, resembling the buzzing of insects. The marble floor feels excessively cold, even through the soles of his shoes. Emily stands in a beam of light, her laughter sounding like thin, breaking glass, beautiful but dangerous. James feels his shirt collar pressing against his throat. The surroundings scream of luxury, but inside this trio there is only cold calculation and a biological struggle for the right to be above. In Nietzsche's world, there is no love. There are only alliances based on strength. And now James must decide whether to remain a decoration in someone else's triumph or to become the architect of his own reality. James has left the room, but Emily is not used to losing. In the next chapter, we will analyze gaslighting through false care, when the predator begins to convince you that you are losing your mind. Do you think that your memory is a reliable storehouse of facts? You are mistaken. Memory is plasticine in the hands of one who knows how to press the right points. The most sophisticated form of power is not physical coercion, but the right to define what is truth and what is your madness. If you allow another to edit your past, you voluntarily give them the keys to your personality. We move to the 4th stage of our autopsy. Chapter 4 is dedicated to the destruction of reality. Chapter 4, Gaslighting Under the Mask of Compassion. 1. Phase, the encounter. A typical suburb of London, Guildford. A kitchen flooded with the sterile white light of LED lamps. On the table are 2 cups of cooling tea. Thomas is feverishly going through folders with documents. He needs to find the property title to the house, which he definitely put in the top drawer of the chest of drawers last night. His sister, Isabella, sits at the table, slowly stirring her tea with a spoon. The sound of metal against porcelain is rhythmic, like dripping water in a torture chamber. "Thomas, dear, you are at it again," Isabella says with an intonation of deep, almost painful tenderness. "We discussed this. You left the documents at the lawyer's office last Thursday." Thomas freezes. In his memory, the moment is clearly etched. He puts the blue folder in the drawer, feeling the roughness of the paper with his fingers. He even remembers the smell of printing ink. "No, Isabella, I took them. I remember entering the house. It was raining. I even stumbled over the threshold. I put them here." Isabella sighs heavily and stands up. She approaches him and places her hand on his shoulder. Her palm seems immeasurably heavy to Thomas. Your stress after father's death. It is doing terrible things to you, she whispers. In her voice there is a poorly hidden triumph disguised as sadness. She knows the folder is in her bag in the car, but her goal is not the document, but control over his mind. You are beginning to invent details that were not there. It did not rain on Thursday, Thomas. It was sunny. Look at the calendar if you do not believe me. Thomas feels the ground slipping from under his feet. Is he really losing his mind? If he was mistaken about the weather, then the memory of the folder is also merely a fruit of his inflamed brain. But I was sure. Your certainty is a symptom, she cuts him off, and for a moment the cold glint of a predator that has cornered its prey flashes in her eyes. You need to rest. Let me handle the business until you come to your senses. 2. Phase, psychological X-ray. Isabella applies gaslighting through false care and the invalidation of perception. Mechanism of attack. The manipulator uses an emotionally significant event, father's death stress, to create a zone of vulnerability. By substituting one small detail, the weather, she destroys the victim's trust in the entire chain of memories. This is called cognitive hacking. Neurochemistry. Thomas's anterior cingulate cortex is activated, which is responsible for detecting errors and conflicts. When external information, sister's words, radically diverges from internal experience, the brain experiences excruciating dissonance. Cortisol is released, blocking the work of the hippocampus, the memory center, which makes Thomas even more suggestible. Physiology, the freeze response. Thomas stops acting actively and enters a mode of self-analysis and doubt, which is exactly what the aggressor required. 3. Phase, psychological precedent. In psychology, this phenomenon was brilliantly studied by Elizabeth Loftus. Her famous Lost in the Mall experiment, 1994, proved that a person can be implanted with a detailed memory of an event that never happened. The essence. Participants were told 4 stories from their childhood, 3 of which were true and 1 was fiction, about how they got lost in a mall. After some time, 25% of the subjects not only remembered the false event, but also supplemented it with fictional details, the color of the clothing of passers-by or the smell of food. Loftus proved memory is not a video camera, but a Wikipedia page that can be edited by anyone who possesses authority or emotional influence. Isabella uses this scientific fact to edit Thomas's reality. 4. Phase, counterstrike. Nietzsche argued there are no facts, only interpretations. In this case, Isabella imposes her interpretation as the only correct one. To win, Thomas must stop trusting his feelings and switch to the rigid logic of objects. Strategic solution, external verification and refusal of discussion. Thomas made a mistake by engaging in a dispute about his memories. One cannot discuss their memory with a manipulator. It is an admission that it might be incorrect. Lesson number 4. The principle of the material trace. If your reality is under attack, immediately terminate the dialogue. Do not try to remember how it really was in the presence of the aggressor. Your salvation lies in objective evidence that does not depend on words. Action. If Thomas had said, "My memories are not a subject for discussion. I will check the facts independently," he would have maintained his sovereignty. Never allow another person to interpret your emotional state or your state of health. As soon as you agree that you are tired or on edge, according to the manipulator's version, you give them the right to manage your will. 5. Phase, sensory immersion. The coldness of the kitchen countertop penetrates through Thomas's palms. The clock on the wall ticks with deafening clarity, counting down the seconds of his capitulation. Isabella stands too close. He feels the warmth of her breath, which contrasts with the icy tone of her words. The air feels thick and sticky, like molasses in which his thoughts are mired. In the reflection of the nickel-plated kettle, he sees his face, distorted, unrecognizable, the face of a man who is beginning to doubt his own existence. In a world where truth is merely a tool of power, Thomas has just allowed this tool to be wrenched from his hands. Thomas is almost broken, but he does not yet know about the false information loop tactic. In the next chapter, we will see how predators use your own secrets against you, creating a situation where any step you take leads to defeat. Your privacy is another illusion you feed to your ego to sleep better at night. In an era of digital surveillance and social transparency, information has become not just a resource, but a detonator. If someone is watching you, they are not just collecting data. They are building a cage around your will. No, the true adept of power knows. He who looks through a keyhole sees only what he is allowed to see. We move to the fifth stage of the dissection. Chapter 5. The Art of the Poisoned Well. Chapter 5. The Information Loop and the Panopticon Effect 1. Phase. The Encounter. Thomas's private office in his house in Surrey. The room is flooded with cold moonlight, which turns shadows into sharp blades. Thomas stands at the bookshelf, his fingers frozen on the spine of an old volume of Napoleon's biography. In the narrow gap between the books, he sees a barely noticeable glint, the tiny lens of a wireless camera installed with surgical precision. His heart does a heavy somersault, and bitterness spreads in his throat. Internal monologue. She did it. Isabella has crossed the line. Every word of mine, every gesture in this room now belongs to her. She expects me to find the camera and start a scandal, revealing my weakness and fear. Or she expects me to make a mistake that she can use in court. The door creaks quietly. Isabella appears in the doorway. She is dressed in a silk robe, holding a glass of water in her hands. She looks sleepy, but Thomas notices how her gaze shifts to the shelf for a fraction of a second before fixing on him. "Are you still not sleeping, Thomas?" Her voice sounds soft, but there is a steel vibration in it. "You look so lost. Perhaps you should give me the keys to the safe with Father's documents. You will feel better if you relieve yourself of this responsibility." Isabella takes a sip of water, closely observing her brother's facial expressions. She wants to see fear. She wants him to feel like a hunted animal under a microscope. Thomas forces himself to relax his shoulders. He slowly turns to her, a mask of polite indifference frozen on his face. "You are right, sister," he says, and his voice sounds absolutely flat. "I know you are watching. I will give you exactly what you want to destroy you with your own hands." "I was just thinking about that. Tomorrow I will prepare all the papers. I have realized that my strength is at an end." 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Isabella uses the concept of the panopticon, creating conditions in which the subject constantly feels the gaze of the overseer, even if they are not sure if they are being watched at that moment. Mechanism of attack. The false information loop. By installing the camera, Isabella captures Thomas's psychological space. The goal is to force him to self-censor, to drive him to paranoia, where every step of his seems like evidence against himself. Neurochemistry. Thomas experiences a powerful release of adrenaline, which he is forced to suppress. Constant suppression of the natural fight-or-flight response leads to the depletion of the prefrontal cortex. This state of hypervigilance consumes a huge amount of glucose, making Thomas's brain vulnerable to suggestion. Terminology. Gaslighting through surveillance. The manipulator creates an environment where the victim stops feeling like the master of their actions. Isabella expects reactive devaluation when Thomas starts to justify himself or get angry, which she will interpret as a sign of his mental instability. 3. Phase, psychological precedent. The central metaphor here is the panopticon proposed by English philosopher Jeremy Bentham and later analyzed by Michel Foucault. It is a prison where one guard can observe all the prisoners while remaining invisible. The prisoners, not knowing if they are being watched at that moment, begin to behave as if they are always being watched. They become their own overseers. In social psychology, this is confirmed by experiments on the audience effect, social facilitation/inhibition. Studies show that the presence of an observer, even invisible or presumed, forces people to act more stereotypically and anxiously if the task is complex. Isabella wants Thomas to break under the weight of this imaginary gaze, committing social suicide through a nervous breakdown. 4. Phase, counter-strike. Nietzsche taught, whatever is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. But he also spoke of the reevaluation of all values. Thomas must reevaluate the camera. From a tool of his suppression, it must become a tool of his triumph. Strategic solution, the poisoned feed. Instead of destroying the camera, Thomas decides to use it to broadcast a false reality. Lesson number 5. The principle of the theater of shadows. If you have discovered surveillance, do not show it. Use the manipulator's communication channel to feed them disinformation. The manipulator believes in their invulnerability as long as they are invisible. Make them visible to themselves by forcing them to act based on false data that you provide to them. Action. Thomas began to perform a play. In the next 2 days, he accidentally left fake bank statements on the table, imitated phone conversations about non-existent debts, and demonstrated fits of despair when he thought the camera saw him. Isabella, consuming this information, began to change her strategy, becoming careless. She was sure that Thomas was defeated and weakened the real defense of her legal rear. 5. Phase, sensory immersion. The air in the office seems electrified, as if before a thunderstorm. The smell of old paper mixes with a faint ozone scent of working electronics. Thomas feels the cold metal of the key in his pocket, the real key to the real safe that Isabella does not even suspect exists. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corridor sounds like a countdown. He looks at Isabella, and her face in the semi-darkness seems like a porcelain mask. She thinks she is the director, but she is merely a spectator in a theater where Thomas has just changed the script. In the world of the will to power, the winner is not the one who sees more, but the one who better hides their true goal. Isabella has swallowed the bait. She is confident in her victory, but the next tactic, false vulnerability, will turn her triumph into a catastrophe. In the 6th chapter, we will see how Thomas delivers the final blow using the philosophy of active nihilism. Do you believe that victory is a loud triumph and a defeated enemy begging for mercy? That is a vulgar delusion. Authentic victory is when your opponent signs their own death warrant, being absolutely certain that they have just hit the jackpot. The greatest vulnerability of a predator is their own ego, bloated from the smell of easy blood. If you want to destroy someone who plays God, become the perfect altar for them. We proceed to the 6th act of our vivisection. Chapter 6, The Art of Strategic Defeat. Chapter 6, The Trap of False Capitulation. 1. Phase, The Encounter. The law firm Harrison and Sons in Kensington. A massive desk made of stained oak, heavy curtains that do not let in the noise of the street, and the smell of old leather mixed with the fresh aroma of printer ink. Thomas sits on the edge of a leather chair, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling slightly as he tries to pick up a pen. Opposite him is Isabella. She looks flawless. A sharp suit from Alexander McQueen, the cold smile of a winner. Beside her sits Mr. Harrison, an elderly lawyer who indifferently looks through the papers. Thomas, sign here. Isabella slides toward him a document on the transfer of management rights for the family fund. Her voice drips with fake compassion. This will put an end to your suffering. You see yourself that you are not coping. These memory lapses, your debts. She casts a quick glance at the lawyer, confirming her status as a rescuer. Thomas takes a deep, convulsive breath. Internal monologue. Look at my hands, Isabella. Do you see this trembling? This is your dose of dopamine. You are so preoccupied with my disintegration, which I have been feeding you through the cameras for the last 2 weeks, that you did not even notice how Harrison changed the pages in the final act. You believe that I am a broken shadow, and that makes you blind. I am not sure, Isabella. Father wanted us to. Thomas falters, his eyes suspiciously glinting. He plays the role of the victim so virtuously that even the experienced Harrison winces slightly out of pity. Father would want the fun to flourish, not sink with you. She cuts him off. She is losing patience. Her will to power demands immediate confirmation. She does not read the fine print in Clause 14.2 because she is certain. A victim in such a state is incapable of a counterattack. Thomas takes the pen. His fingers leave a moist mark on the paper. He slowly writes his signature. That is all, he whispers, covering his face with his hands. In reality, he is hiding a cold, predatory smile. Clause 14.2 states that in the event of management transfer, where there is evidence of fraud or surveillance by the receiving party, all assets transfer to an irrevocable trust managed by a third party of whom Isabella knows nothing. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Thomas applied strategic masking and used Isabella's confirmation bias against her. Mechanism of attack. Thomas fed Isabella an image she passionately desired to see. In psychology, this is called expectation reinforcement. When a predator sees all the signs of weakness they themselves try to provoke, through gaslighting and surveillance, their critical thinking shuts down. They fall into the trap of their own rightness. Neurochemistry. Isabella's brain is currently flooded with dopamine. The expectation of triumph activates the reward system, which suppresses the prefrontal cortex, responsible for risk analysis. She is in a state of informational blindness. She is physically incapable of noticing a trick, as her brain is already celebrating the victory. Terminology. False compliance. This is a tactic where you agree with the manipulator's arguments to lull their vigilance and force them to make a careless step. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. It is appropriate here to recall the famous experiment by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris, 1999, known as the invisible gorilla. The essence. Subjects were asked to count the number of passes made by people in white t-shirts on video. They were so concentrated on the task that more than half of the participants did not notice a person in a gorilla suit who walked through the center of the frame, stopped, and thumped their chest. In our situation, Isabella is the subject counting passes, signs of Thomas's madness. Clause 14.2 in the contract is the gorilla. Her focus on destroying her brother created a zone of perceptual blindness. She sees only what corresponds to her scenario of power, ignoring the objective reality that will destroy her. 4. Phase. Counter-strike. Nietzsche proclaimed, To live is to constantly push away from oneself that which wants to die. Thomas killed the weak brother within himself to allow the strategist to be born. He used his vulnerability as an invisibility cloak. Strategic solution: poisonous capitulation. If you know that the opponent will not stop until they take everything, give it to them, but make sure that everything is packed with thermite. Lesson number 6, the principle of the mirror abyss. When a toxic person tries to corner you, do not resist. Accelerate your fall. Become so pathetic and pliable that the aggressor loses all caution. Your task is to provoke them into a decisive strike at the moment when you have already built a wall behind your back against which they will break their fists. Action. As soon as the signature was placed, Thomas straightened up. His voice suddenly gained baritonal depth. Isabella, by the way, the camera behind the books on the third shelf, writes to a cloud to which Mr. Harrison has access. And yes, Clause 14.2. Read it now, carefully. Isabella's face began to slowly turn gray. She realized that her victory was a legal noose that she had tightened around her own neck. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. A dead silence reigns in the office. Only Isabella's heavy breathing is heard. The sound resembles the torn bellows of an old blacksmith's forge. The light from the desk lamp emphasizes every wrinkle on her face, which has suddenly aged by 10 years. Thomas stands up, and the sound of his footsteps on the parquet sounds like hammer blows. He smells of victory, a cold, metallic scent of success. Outside the window, Kensington lives its own life, but in this room, a change of predator has just occurred. Isabella looks at the document she so craved, and now it seems to her a piece of red-hot coal. In Nietzsche's world, there is no place for those who overestimated their cunning. Isabella is legally destroyed, but the last, most dangerous stage remains: radical pragmatism and the will to power. In the final chapter, we will see how Thomas definitively clears the field, leaving the enemy no chance for revenge. Victory is not the final. It is a point of no return. Most people make a fatal mistake. They stop when the enemy is defeated. They allow themselves the luxury of mercy, not understanding that an undefeated predator is the seed of a future catastrophe. In Nietzsche's world, there is no place for forgiveness. There is only overcoming and establishing a new order. If you have destroyed an old hierarchy, you are obliged to burn the very memory of it. We proceed to the final act of the psychological autopsy. Chapter 7. Total Annihilation and the Triumph of Will. Chapter 7. Total Annihilation and the Will to Power 1. Phase. The Encounter. The legal office plunged into a state of dead silence, interrupted only by Isabella's hoarse, intermittent breathing. She jumped from her seat, her flawless jacket becoming crooked. She grabbed the signed document, trying to tear it, but the thick paper with watermarks only pitifully crunched in her trembling fingers. You could not have done this," her voice broke into a screech. "I am your sister. Everything I did was for the sake of preserving our legacy. You are sick, Thomas. You are simply raving." Thomas sits motionless. His gaze is directed not at his sister, but through her. Internal monologue. Look at how her facade collapses. Now she will go through all the stages of a predator's agony, from furious denial to an attempt to evoke pity. She calls it a legacy, but in reality she mourns the loss of control. My task is not to enter into an emotional resonance. I must be a mirror in which she sees her own insignificance. "Isabella, sit down," Thomas said in an icy tone. There was neither anger nor triumph in this voice, only a statement of fact. Your attempts to destroy the document are pointless. An electronic copy has already been certified and sent to the trust. The camera you installed in my office recorded not my madness, but your triumph at the moment of signing. You yourself provided evidence of your self-serving intent. Isabella suddenly fell silent. Her face, a moment ago red with anger, became ashen gray. She slowly sank back into her chair. Her eyes feverishly ran around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "What do you want?" she whispered. "Money? You know that I want you to disappear from my reality." Thomas cut her off. "You are no longer a subject. You are an annoying hindrance that has been eliminated. From this moment on, you are deprived of access to the family accounts, the house, and any social connections that you have parasitized for so many years. This is not revenge. This is sanitary cleaning." 2. Phase, psychological X-ray. What is happening to Isabella is narcissistic injury of a colossal scale, turning into an extinction burst. Mechanism of attack. Thomas applied the tactic of radical pragmatism. He did not just win a dispute. He dismantled the very platform on which Isabella stood. By depriving the manipulator of resources and the opportunity to influence the perception of others, through the recording from her own camera, he condemned her to social death. Neurochemistry. Isabella is experiencing a collapse of the dopamine system. A sharp drop in status causes a state close to physical shock. The prefrontal cortex, finding no logical exit, shuts down, handing over control to the limbic system. She is in a state of complete cognitive disorientation. Physiology. The defeat response. Suppression of serotonin production leads to her posture becoming slumped and her movements uncoordinated. She physically shrinks in space, losing the halo of dominance. 3. Phase, psychological precedent. In psychology, this state of deep collapse of will after the failure of manipulation correlates with Martin Seligman's theory of learned helplessness. The essence. In the course of experiments, 1967, it was established that if a subject, originally an animal, but later confirmed on humans, understands that none of their actions influence a negative result, and they completely lose control over the environment, they fall into a state of deep apathy and stop taking any attempts at salvation, even when an exit becomes obvious. Isabella, faced with the fact that all her tools of influence, gaslighting, triangulation, surveillance, have turned against her, is experiencing psychological paralysis. Thomas created a situation where her will to power smashed against the absolute wall of his calculation. 4. Phase, counter-strike. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, describes 3 transformations of the spirit: the camel, endurance; the lion, destruction of old values; and the child, a new beginning. Thomas has completed the stage of the lion. He has destroyed the moral bonds of family duty that allowed Isabella to parasitize him. Strategic solution, grim trigger, from game theory. This is a strategy in repeated games where a player cooperates as long as the opponent does not betray them. After the very first betrayal, the player forever switches to a mode of absolute punishment, leaving no chance for reconciliation. Lesson number 7. The law of the final break. Never leave the door ajar, just in case. Toxic people perceive hope as a weakness that can be used for a new attack. Having defeated a manipulator, you must ensure their complete isolation from your resources. Your strength lies in your ability to be absolutely indifferent to their future fate. Action. Thomas stood up and nodded to Lawyer Harrison. The expropriation procedure has begun. Isabella, you have 2 hours to collect personal belongings from the house. Security will accompany you. He left the office without looking back. He felt neither joy nor sadness, only purity. His mind was empty and clear, like the sky after a storm. He had overcome the role of the victim and the role of the avenger. He had become the creator of his own distance. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. Outside, Thomas was met by the cold air of London, smelling of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. But for him, this air was the cleanest in his life. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement was rhythmic and firm. The world around him no longer seemed hostile or threatening. It seemed like plastic material, ready to take the form of his will. Inside the office, Isabella remained sitting in the shadows, her figure barely discernible behind the glass. She became a part of the past, an old exhibit in the museum of his weakness. Thomas got into the car, closed the door, and the click of the central lock sounded like the final chord of a symphony. Ahead was only pure will. In the world of predators, he had stopped being the prey. He had become the one who establishes the rules of the game. Your training in the anatomical theater of human vices has come to an end. We have dissected lies, pity, jealousy, and madness, exposing them to light under the cold lamps of the operating room. Now that you see the strings by which they tried to pull you, you can no longer be a puppet. Ignorance was your only excuse. Now it has become your choice. Epilogue. Beyond good and evil. You entered here hoping to find a shield, but I gave you a scalpel. In a world where biology dictates hierarchy and social predators mask themselves as friends and mentors, your only authentic protection is the crystal clarity of consciousness. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman, a rope over an abyss. Toxic people are those who try to push you into this abyss, or even worse, force you to believe that the abyss does not exist. They strive to make your will an appendage of theirs, to turn your neurochemistry into a tool of their comfort. But having gone through these 7 chapters, you have realized a fundamental truth. Your reality belongs only to you as long as you are ready to defend it." Final psychological accent, self-actualization of power. From the point of view of ethology, dominance is not always the right of the strong. It is often the absence of resistance from the weak. When you stop reacting to triggers, guilt, fear, jealousy, you exit the manipulator's food chain. You become an inorganic object for them, something that cannot be consumed. This is the highest form of psychological resilience. Sensory conclusion. Imagine early morning after a prolonged storm. The air is so transparent that it seems fragile. You are standing on the edge of a cliff, and before you stretches the ocean, dark, deep, and absolutely calm. In this calmness there is no kindness. In it there is only enormous, inexhaustible power. You feel the cold of the stone under your feet and the warmth of the rising sun on your face. The old voices of the manipulators, Mark, Sarah, Isabella, are now no louder than the rustle of dry leaves below in the valley you have left behind. You no longer seek approval in the eyes of others. You yourself have become the light that defines the shadows. Your empathy is now not an open wound, but a precise diagnostic tool. You give it only to those who are equal to you in strength of spirit. For the rest, you have only icy politeness and impeccable pragmatism. Knowledge of the mechanisms of the psyche is your main freedom. Subscribe to explore the hidden facets of human behavior together, and be sure to write in the comments which psychological pattern or strategy we will analyze next time. Let us seek the truth together.